What happens when three armed men think they've found an easy target in a parking garage late at night? What they don't know is that the woman walking alone to her car isn't just any ordinary person. She's Sarah Mitchell, a decorated Navy SEAL who has survived combat missions in 3 different countries and trained for situations exactly like this one. In the next few minutes, these attackers will learn the hardest lesson of their lives. Appearances can be deadly deceiving. This is the true story of how a routine evening turned into a masterclass in self-defense and why you should never judge someone's capabilities by their appearance. Some people freeze when danger strikes. Others fight. But Navy SEALs? They eliminate threats with surgical precision. This is what happened when 3 criminals picked the wrong woman on the wrong night in downtown Seattle. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her purse strap as she walked across the dimly lit parking garage beneath the Seattle Convention Center. At 32 years old, she stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. To anyone watching, she looked like just another professional woman heading home after a long day at work. Her navy blue blazer and black slacks gave her the appearance of an office worker, perhaps an accountant or marketing executive, finishing up late at the office. But appearances, as 3 men lurking behind concrete pillars were about to discover, can be fatally misleading. Sarah had just finished a corporate security consultation meeting on the 15th floor. After 8 years as a Navy SEAL, including 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, she now worked as a private security consultant for major corporations. Her job involved assessing vulnerabilities, training executive protection teams, and designing security protocols for high-risk scenarios. It was Wednesday evening, nearly 9 o'clock, and the parking garage was mostly empty, except for a handful of cars belonging to the building's night shift workers. As she walked toward her silver Honda Accord, Sarah's trained sensors automatically scanned her environment. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows between the concrete support columns. The sound of her heels echoed off the walls, mixing with the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional car passing by on the street above. Everything seemed normal, but something felt off. During her time in the SEALs, Sarah had learned to trust her instincts completely. Right now, those instincts were telling her she wasn't alone. Her peripheral vision caught movement near a white van parked 3 spaces away from her car. She maintained her casual pace while mentally cataloging possible escape routes and potential weapons within reach. Marcus Thompson, 28, crouched behind the van with his 2 companions. He had been watching the parking garage for weeks, learning the patterns of when people came and went. Late evening was always the best time for what they had planned. Fewer witnesses, darker lighting, and people were usually tired and distracted after long work days. Marcus had done this type of operation 12 times before, with perfect success. Grab the purse, take any jewelry, maybe the car keys if the vehicle looked valuable enough, and disappear into the night before anyone could react. His partner Jake Morrison, 25, waited near the stairwell exit, ready to block any attempt to flee toward the building. Jake was nervous, constantly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. This was only his 3rd job, and he still felt his heart racing every time they prepared to move. The 3rd man, Danny Rodriguez, 31, positioned himself near the garage entrance ramp. Danny was the experienced muscle of the group, standing 6 feet 2 and weighing nearly 240 pounds. His job was to intimidate and control the situation if things went wrong. They had watched Sarah enter the garage 40 minutes earlier and had been waiting patiently for her return. From their observation, she appeared to be an ideal target. Alone, well-dressed, indicating money, carrying what looked like an expensive leather purse, and walking with the slightly tired posture of someone who had worked a long day. Marcus had specifically chosen her because she seemed like someone who would comply quickly rather than resist. Sarah reached her car and pulled out her keys, but instead of immediately unlocking the door, she paused and pretended to check her phone. This gave her a few extra seconds to assess the situation more carefully. In the reflection of her car window, she could see the outline of someone crouched behind the van. Her combat training kicked in automatically, running through threat assessment protocols she had practiced thousands of times. 3 potential hostiles, positions approximately mapped, limited escape routes, no backup available, civilians potentially in the area. Her mind quickly calculated options while her body remained relaxed and seemingly unaware of any danger. She had learned long ago that the element of surprise was just as valuable for the defender as it was for the attacker. Marcus whispered into his radio headset, "Target is at her vehicle, moving in 30 seconds. Jake, confirm your position." "I'm ready at the stairs," Jake responded, his voice betraying his nervousness. "Danny, you good at the ramp?" All set. Let's do this quick and clean. Sarah heard the faint sound of electronic communication but couldn't make out the words. However, the coordinated positioning of the three men told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a random mugging. They had been watching, planning, and were now executing what they believed would be an easy score. As a Navy SEAL, Sarah had been trained in close quarters combat, tactical awareness, weapons handling, and psychological operations. She had faced enemy combatants in situations far more dangerous than three amateur criminals in a parking garage. But more importantly, she had been trained in the mindset that made Navy SEALs so effective: never give up, never surrender, and always fight with maximum efficiency and minimum wasted motion. She slipped her keys between her fingers, creating an improvised weapon, and slightly adjusted her stance to better distribute her weight. To any observer, she still looked like a tired office worker getting ready to drive home. But internally, she had shifted into combat mode, her breathing controlled, her mind clear, and her body prepared for action. Marcus stood up from behind the van and began walking towards her, trying to appear casual. He wore dark jeans and a black hoodie, with the hood pulled up to shadow his face. In his right hand, concealed inside his sweatshirt pocket, he gripped a 4-inch folding knife. His plan was simple: approach from behind, grab the purse, and demand money and jewelry. If she resisted, the knife would convince her to cooperate. "Excuse me, miss," Marcus called out when he was about 20 feet away. Sarah turned around slowly, maintaining the appearance of an innocent civilian, while actually positioning herself to better assess all three threats. She could now see Marcus approaching directly, Jake moving to block the stairwell, and Danny starting to close off the garage entrance. "Yes, can I help you?" she replied in a friendly tone, though every muscle in her body was coiled and ready. "Yeah, I think you dropped something back there," Marcus said, pointing vaguely toward where he had been hiding. It was a classic distraction technique designed to make her turn around and become vulnerable to attack from behind. Sarah smiled politely, but didn't turn around. "I don't think I dropped anything, but thank you for checking." This response wasn't what Marcus had expected. Most people would have immediately turned to look, or at least shown some concern about potentially losing something. Her calm reaction made him slightly uneasy, but he was too committed to the plan to back down now. "Are you sure? It looked like maybe your phone or wallet," he pressed, continuing to walk closer. "I'm quite sure I have everything," Sarah replied, her voice remaining steady and pleasant. Marcus was now only 10 feet away, close enough that Sarah could see his eyes darting nervously and noticed the bulge in his pocket where he was concealing the knife. Her SEAL training had taught her to read body language and recognize threat indicators. Everything about this man screamed danger. Jake had reached the stairwell and was trying to look casual while obviously blocking the exit. Danny was positioning himself to cut off the garage entrance. The coordination of their movement confirmed what Sarah already suspected. This was a planned attack, with multiple assailants working together. In her mind, Sarah ran through her options one final time. She could attempt to get into her car and drive away, but that would require turning her back on the immediate threat and fumbling with keys and locks. She could try to run toward the stairwell, but Jake was already blocking that route. She could attempt to reach the garage entrance, but Danny was moving to intercept. Or she could do what her training had taught her: eliminate the threats systematically and efficiently. Marcus was now close enough to make his move. He pulled the knife from his pocket and pointed it towards Sarah while reaching for her purse with his other hand. "Give me the purse and any jewelry you're wearing. Do it now, and nobody gets hurt." This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. The threat was now clear and immediate, giving her legal and tactical justification for whatever actions she needed to take to protect herself. More importantly, her attackers had just revealed their primary weapon and showed her exactly how they intended to execute their plan. What Marcus didn't know was that he had just threatened someone who had been trained by the United States Navy to handle much more dangerous situations than a parking garage mugging. What Jake and Danny didn't know was that their carefully planned attack was about to turn into the worst mistake of their criminal careers. Sarah looked directly into Marcus's eyes and spoke in a calm, clear voice that carried just a hint of the authority she had learned to project during her military service. "You need to walk away right now." Marcus laughed, thinking her response was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. "Lady, I don't think you understand the situation here. Give me your stuff or this is going to get very unpleasant for you." Sarah's expression didn't change. "I understand the situation perfectly. You have about 5 seconds to leave before this becomes a very bad decision for all three of you." The confidence in her voice made Marcus hesitate for just a moment. There was something about the way she spoke that didn't match his expectations of how a victim should react. But he had come too far to back down now, and his partners were watching. He couldn't afford to look weak or indecisive. Last warning, lady. Hand over the purse. Sarah took a small step backward, not in retreat, but to create optimal fighting distance. Her years of combat training had taught her that positioning was everything in close-quarters combat. She needed to be close enough to strike effectively, but far enough away to avoid the initial knife thrust. No, she said simply. That single word, spoken with absolute certainty and no trace of fear, should have been a warning to Marcus that he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he realized. But criminal overconfidence and the pressure of performing in front of his partners pushed him past the point of rational decision-making. Marcus lunged forward with the knife, aiming for Sarah's midsection while grabbing for her purse with his free hand. It was a clumsy, predictable attack that telegraphed his intentions long before he actually moved. What happened next would be burned into the memory of all three attackers for the rest of their lives. The moment Marcus committed to his attack, Sarah's body moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours training for exactly this type of encounter. As the knife came toward her, she stepped laterally to her left, avoiding the blade while simultaneously grabbing Marcus's wrist with her right hand. The movement was so fast and smooth that Marcus didn't realize what had happened until he felt his arm being twisted in a direction it was never meant to go. Sarah's left hand came up in a sharp strike to Marcus's elbow joint, applying pressure in a way that forced him to release the knife immediately or risk having his arm broken. The weapon clattered to the concrete floor as Marcus cried out in pain and surprise. Before he could react further, Sarah pivoted on her left foot and drove her right elbow into his solar plexus, knocking the wind out of him and sending him stumbling backward. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds. Marcus went from holding a knife and feeling in control to being disarmed, injured, and gasping for air while trying to figure out what had just happened to him. Jake and Danny watched in shock from their positions. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. The plan was simple. One person threatens, the victim complies, everyone walks away. They had never seen anyone move like Sarah had just moved, and they certainly had never seen Marcus get taken down so quickly and efficiently. Sarah immediately turned her attention to Jake, who was still blocking the stairwell but now looked uncertain about whether he wanted to be involved in whatever this situation had become. She could see the fear in his eyes as he processed what he had just witnessed. "Your friend just learned the hard way that I'm not an easy target," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the parking garage with clear authority. "You have a choice to make right now. Walk away or find out what happens when you threaten someone who fights back." Jake's hands were shaking as he tried to decide what to do. He had signed up for quick, easy money, not for fighting someone who obviously knew how to handle herself in combat. But Danny was still positioned behind Sarah. And Jake didn't want to abandon his partners, even if the situation had gone completely wrong. Danny, however, was not ready to give up. At nearly 240 pounds and with a significant reach advantage, he was confident he could overpower Sarah through sheer physical force. He had been in plenty of fights before and had never met anyone he couldn't intimidate or overpower. Watching Marcus get taken down had surprised him, but he attributed it to Marcus being careless rather than Sarah being genuinely dangerous. "Jake, stay where you are," Danny called out as he started walking towards Sarah. "She got lucky with Marcus, but there's no way she can handle both of us." Sarah heard Danny approaching from behind and quickly calculated her new tactical situation. Marcus was still bent over trying to catch his breath, but he would recover soon and potentially rejoin the fight. Jake was blocking her escape route but seemed hesitant to engage directly. Danny was the largest and strongest of the three, and his position behind her made him the most immediate threat. She picked up Marcus's knife from where it had fallen, not to use as a weapon, but to prevent any of her attackers from retrieving it. In her SEAL training, controlling weapons and denying them to enemies was always a priority in close-quarters combat situations. Danny reached for Sarah's shoulder, intending to spin her around and grab her in a bear hug that would immobilize her arms and allow him to control the situation through superior size and strength. It was a reasonable strategy against most opponents, but Sarah was far from most opponents. As Danny's hand approached her shoulder, Sarah dropped low and spun to her right, avoiding his grasp while positioning herself to attack his legs. She swept her right leg across the back of both his knees, using a technique that combined momentum with precise targeting to disrupt his balance. Danny's legs gave way and he started to fall backward. Before he could hit the ground, Sarah rose from her crouch and drove her palm upward into Danny's chin in a strike known as a palm heel. The blow snapped his head back and sent him crashing to the concrete floor, where he lay stunned and trying to figure out how someone so much smaller had put him down so decisively. Jake watched his two partners get neutralized within 30 seconds of each other and realized he was now facing this woman alone. Everything about the situation told him to run, but his feet seemed frozen to the spot. He had never been in a real fight before, and seeing two larger, more experienced men get taken down so easily filled him with a level of fear he had never experienced. Sarah turned to face Jake directly, giving him her full attention. She could see that he was the weakest link in the group, probably inexperienced and definitely terrified by what he had just witnessed. Her SEAL training had taught her that psychological warfare could be just as effective as physical combat, and sometimes more so. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, walking slowly toward Jake while maintaining eye contact. "You're going to help your friends get up, and all three of you are going to leave this garage immediately. If any of you ever come back here, or if I see any of you again anywhere, the next encounter won't end as gently as this one." Jake nodded frantically, eager to agree to anything that would get him out of this situation. He had already decided that his brief career as a criminal was over, regardless of what Marcus and Danny might want to do. But Marcus was starting to recover from the blow to his solar plexus, and his embarrassment at being taken down so quickly was turning into anger. He had built his reputation on being tough and in control, and having that image shattered by a woman in a business suit was more than his ego could handle. "This isn't over," Marcus wheezed as he struggled to stand up straight. "You think you're tough because you got lucky twice? Let's see how you do when we all come at you together." Sarah sighed and shook her head. Some people, she had learned, needed to have lessons repeated before they truly understood them. Marcus was apparently one of those people. "I tried to give you an easy way out," she replied. "But if you insist on learning this the hard way, I'm prepared to teach you." Marcus looked around for his knife and realized Sarah had picked it up. His eyes darted toward Danny, who was still on the ground but starting to move, then toward Jake, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the concrete wall behind him. "Danny, get up. Jake, stop looking like a scared little kid and help us finish this." Danny slowly pushed himself to his feet, shaking his head to clear the cobwebs from Sarah's palm strike. He was hurt and disoriented, but his pride was injured even more than his body. Like Marcus, he couldn't accept that he had been outfought so decisively by someone he had assumed would be an easy victim. Jake remained frozen against the wall, caught between his fear of Sarah and his fear of abandoning his partners. He could see that continuing this confrontation was only going to lead to more pain and humiliation, but he didn't know how to extract himself from the situation. Sarah assessed the new dynamics of the confrontation. Two of her opponents were injured but still potentially dangerous, especially if they coordinated their attack. The third was scared but might still participate if pressured by his partners. The smart tactical decision would be to eliminate the threats decisively before they could reorganize and mount a more effective assault. However, Sarah also recognized that these were not enemy combatants in a war zone. They were criminals who had made a serious mistake, but they were still civilians in a domestic setting. Her training had also taught her about proportional response and the legal implications of self-defense. She needed to use only the amount of force necessary to protect herself and end the threat. "Last chance," she warned, holding up Marcus's knife where all three men could see it. "Take your friends and leave now, while you still can." Marcus's response was to charge at her again, this time attempting to tackle her around the waist and drive her to the ground where his weight advantage might give him an edge. Danny moved to support him, though more slowly due to his injuries. Jake remained pressed against the wall, paralyzed by indecision and fear. Sarah had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but she had given them multiple opportunities to walk away. Now she would have to end the confrontation definitively, using whatever level of force was necessary to ensure her safety and make it clear that continuing the attack would be futile. As Marcus and Danny approached, Sarah's mind shifted into the tactical mode she had used countless times during her military service. She calculated angles of attack, assessed the physical capabilities of her opponents, and planned a sequence of defensive actions that would neutralize both threats efficiently while minimizing the risk of causing permanent injury. Marcus reached her first, diving low to try to tackle her legs. Sarah sidestepped and brought her knee up into his ribs as he went past her, sending him sprawling across the concrete floor. The impact knocked the wind out of him again and left him gasping and clutching his side. Danny tried to grab her from behind while she was dealing with Marcus, but Sarah had been tracking his position throughout the encounter. She turned inside his reaching arms and delivered a precise strike to a pressure point just below his rib cage. The blow caused Danny's legs to buckle and sent him back down to the ground, this time with no immediate plans to get back up. Jake watched his partners get defeated again and finally found his voice. "Stop! Please, just stop! We're done. We're leaving right now." Sarah looked at the three men, all of whom were now on the ground in various states of pain and defeat. Marcus was still trying to catch his breath. Danny was holding his ribs and looking dazed, and Jake was finally moving away from the wall with his hands raised in surrender. "Smart choice," Sarah replied. She walked over to Marcus and crouched down next to him, speaking in a voice low enough that only he could hear. "I know you're thinking about coming back later, maybe with more people or weapons. Don't. I've memorized all your faces, and I have connections in law enforcement and the military. If anything happens to me, or if any of you commit another crime in this city, those connections will make your lives very difficult. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded weakly, no longer thinking about revenge or saving face. The pain in his ribs and the complete ease with which Sarah had defeated him, and Danny had finally convinced him that he was dealing with someone far beyond his ability to handle. Sarah stood up and addressed all three men. "Help each other get up and leave. Don't look back, and don't ever let me see any of you again." Jake immediately moved to help Danny to his feet, while Marcus struggled to stand on his own. Within 2 minutes, all three men were limping toward the garage exit, supporting each other and moving as quickly as their injuries would allow. Sarah watched them until they disappeared up the ramp to street level, then waited another 5 minutes to make sure they weren't planning to return with reinforcements. Only when she was completely satisfied that the threat was over did she finally unlock her car and prepare to drive home. As she sat in the driver's seat, Sarah reflected on what had just happened. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had reminded her of why her military training remained so valuable even in civilian life. The skills she had learned as a Navy SEAL weren't just for combat zones. They were for any situation where people tried to use violence and intimidation to get what they wanted from others. She started her car and drove home, knowing that 3 criminals had just learned a lesson they would never forget. 20 minutes after the confrontation ended, Sarah sat in her apartment kitchen, sipping green tea and reviewing the events in her mind. Her apartment was a modest 1-bedroom unit in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, decorated with a few military memorabilia items and photographs from her SEAL days, but mostly furnished with the practical simplicity of someone who valued function over form. She had already changed out of her business attire and into comfortable jeans and a sweatshirt. Her hands were steady as she held the mug, showing no signs of the adrenaline that had coursed through her system during the fight. Years of combat experience had taught her how to manage post-action stress and return quickly to a normal physiological state. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus, Danny, and Jake were having a very different kind of evening. They had driven to Danny's apartment in his beat-up pickup truck, mostly in silence, except for occasional groans of pain and muttered curses. The mood in the vehicle was a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and genuine fear about what had just happened to them. Danny's apartment was a cluttered studio in a rundown building south of downtown. Empty beer cans covered most surfaces, and the air smelled like cigarettes and takeout food. Danny collapsed onto his couch and immediately opened another beer, despite the pain in his ribs making it difficult to lift his arms above his shoulders. "What the hell just happened back there?" he asked, directing the question to both his partners, but mostly to himself. Marcus was pacing around the small apartment, holding his side where Sarah's knee had connected with his ribs. His ego was bruised even more severely than his body, and he was struggling to process how completely and easily they had been defeated. "She had to be military or police or something," Marcus said. "Normal people don't move like that. Normal people don't know how to fight like that." Jake sat in a folding chair near the window, staring out at the street below. He had barely spoken since leaving the parking garage, too busy replaying the confrontation in his mind and thinking about how close he had come to being seriously hurt.
"Maybe we should just forget this ever happened," Jake said quietly.
"Find some other way to make money. This whole thing was a disaster from start to finish." Danny laughed bitterly. "Yeah, because that's what you do when someone embarrasses you like that. You just walk away and pretend it never happened." "She wasn't just someone," Jake replied, finally turning to look at his partners. "Did you see how she moved? Did you hear the way she talked? She knew exactly what she was doing from the moment we approached her. She was in complete control the entire time." Marcus stopped pacing and stared at Jake. "So, what are you saying?"
That we should be afraid of her? That we should hide because some woman in a business suit beat us up?
"I'm saying we should be smart," Jake responded.
"Whatever she is, whoever she trained with, she's not someone we can handle. She gave us multiple chances to walk away, and we kept pushing. If we try something like this again, she might not be so generous next time." Danny took another long drink from his beer and winced as the motion aggravated his injured ribs. Jake's right. I've been in a lot of fights, and I've never seen anyone move like that. She didn't just get lucky. She knew exactly what she was doing. She disabled both of us like we were amateurs. Because we are amateurs, Jake said. We've been picking on easy targets, people who don't fight back. Tonight we tried to rob someone who actually knows how to defend herself. And look how that turned out. Marcus finally stopped pacing and sat down heavily in a kitchen chair. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They had not only failed spectacularly, but they had also revealed themselves to someone who might be connected to law enforcement or military personnel. If she decided to report them or track them down, their small-time criminal careers could be over before they really began. What do you think she meant when she said she had connections? Marcus asked. I think she meant exactly what she said, Jake replied. People don't talk like that unless they can back it up. And given how easily she handled both of you, I believe she can back up anything she says. Back at her apartment, Sarah was making similar calculations, but from a different perspective. She was considering whether to report the attempted mugging to the police and what the implications might be if she did. As a former Navy SEAL, she had connections within law enforcement, and she knew that a report from her would be taken seriously. However, she also recognized that the three men who had attacked her were probably small-time criminals rather than career violent offenders. They had been armed with only one knife between them, their coordination had been poor, and their planning had obvious flaws. Most importantly, they had all backed down once it became clear they were outmatched, rather than escalating to more dangerous weapons or tactics. Sarah decided to take a middle approach. She would not file an official police report immediately, but she would document the incident thoroughly and keep the information available in case the three men decided to try something similar again, either with her or with other victims. She opened her laptop and began typing a detailed account of the evening's events, including physical descriptions of all three attackers, their approximate ages, and the specific threats they had made. She also noted the vehicle they had used to leave the scene and the direction they had traveled. If they struck again, this information could be valuable to investigators. As she typed, Sarah reflected on the broader implications of what had happened. Her SEAL training had prepared her for combat situations, but it had also taught her about the psychology of violence and the importance of understanding why conflicts occurred in the first place. Marcus, Danny, and Jake had chosen to become criminals, but they were also products of economic circumstances, social environment, and personal choices that had led them to see robbing innocent people as an acceptable way to make money. Defeating them in combat had solved Sarah's immediate problem, but it hadn't addressed the underlying issues that had created the situation. At the same time, Sarah knew that showing mercy to people who were willing to threaten and harm others was not always the right choice. If she had been a different person, an elderly individual, someone with disabilities, or just a regular citizen without combat training, the outcome of the confrontation could have been very different. Her attackers had been prepared to use violence to get what they wanted, and there was no guarantee they would limit that violence to non-lethal levels. 3 hours after the confrontation, Danny's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered it anyway, thinking it might be related to a potential job opportunity he had been waiting to hear about. Danny Rodriguez? A woman's voice asked.
Yeah, who's this? This is someone who wants to make sure you and your friends understood the message you received tonight.
Danny's blood ran cold as he recognized Sarah's voice. Somehow, she had found out who he was and gotten his phone number.
The implications of that level of investigation capability terrified him more than the physical beating he had received.
I don't know what you're talking about, Danny said, though his voice betrayed his fear.
Yes, you do. You and Marcus Thompson and Jake Morrison tried to rob me in a parking garage tonight. It didn't go well for any of you. The fact that she knew all their full names confirmed Danny's worst fears. She hadn't just defended herself in the moment. She had actively investigated them afterward. That suggested a level of resources and connections that went far beyond what a typical civilian would have access to. What do you want? Danny asked. I want to make sure you understand that what happened tonight was a warning, not a punishment. If any of you commit another crime in this city, or if you bother me or anyone else again, the consequences will be much more severe than a few bruises and hurt feelings. We get it, Danny said quickly. We're done. We won't bother you or anyone else. Good. But just to make sure the message is clear, I want you to know that I have detailed files on all three of you now. Where you live, where you work, who your families are, and what your criminal histories look like. I also have contacts in law enforcement who would be very interested in what you tried to do tonight. Danny's hands were shaking as he held the phone. The idea that she had investigated them so thoroughly in just a few hours suggested capabilities that went far beyond what he had imagined possible. I also want you to deliver a message to your friends, Sarah continued. Marcus seems like the type who might be thinking about revenge or trying to prove something. Make sure he understands that would be the worst mistake of his life. I was gentle with you tonight because I believe people can change. But if you force me to defend myself again, I won't be gentle. I'll tell them, Danny said. See that you do. And Danny, find a better way to make money. You're all young enough to turn your lives around if you want to. Don't waste that opportunity. The line went dead, leaving Danny staring at his phone and wondering how his simple plan to make some quick money had turned into the most frightening experience of his life. He immediately called Marcus and Jake, relaying Sarah's message word for word. The conversation that followed was tense and emotional, with Marcus initially talking about finding out who Sarah was and getting back at her for the humiliation they had suffered. But Jake and Danny wore him down with logical arguments about the futility and danger of pursuing any kind of revenge against someone with Sarah's capabilities and connections. By the end of the conversation, all three men had agreed that their criminal partnership was over and that they would find legitimate ways to support themselves. Back in her apartment, Sarah finished documenting the incident and saved the file in an encrypted folder on her computer. She had made the phone call to Danny not because she enjoyed intimidating people, but because she wanted to ensure that the lesson from tonight's confrontation would stick. Her investigation into the three men had been relatively simple, using skills and resources she had developed during her military career. License plate numbers led to vehicle registrations, which led to addresses and background checks. Within a few hours, she had complete profiles on all three attackers, including their criminal histories, employment records, and family connections. What she had found was roughly what she expected. Three young men with limited education, few job prospects, and a history of minor crimes that had gradually escalated to more serious offenses. They weren't career criminals or violent predators. They were just people who had made bad choices and found themselves in situations where crime seemed like their best option for making money. Sarah hoped that tonight's experience would be enough to convince them to choose a different path, but she also knew that real change would require more than just fear of consequences. These men needed opportunities, support systems, and reasons to believe that legitimate success was possible for them. She made a mental note to research local job training programs and community organizations that worked with at-risk individuals. If any of the three men showed genuine interest in changing their lives, she might be able to point them toward resources that could help make that change possible. For now, though, Sarah was satisfied that the immediate threat had been neutralized and that her attackers understood the consequences of continuing their criminal activities. She finished her tea, checked the locks on her doors and windows, and prepared for bed, knowing that she had handled a dangerous situation as well as anyone could reasonably expect. 2 weeks after the parking garage incident, Detective Maria Santos of the Seattle Police Department noticed a pattern emerging in the crime reports crossing her desk. 3 separate attempted muggings in downtown Seattle had been thwarted by victims who displayed unusually effective self-defense skills. In each case, the would-be criminals had fled without successfully completing their crimes, and all had described their intended victims as having military or law enforcement training. Detective Santos had been working robbery and assault cases for 8 years, and she had never seen such a cluster of failed attacks where the victims had fought back so successfully. Most self-defense situations resulted in either the criminal succeeding despite resistance or the victim escaping through luck or intervention by others. But these 3 cases all involved victims who had clearly dominated their attackers through superior combat skills. The first case involved a man in his 50s who had been approached by 2 teenagers with knives near Pike Place Market. According to the police report, the man had disarmed both attackers and held them until police arrived. When questioned, the man had identified himself as a retired Army Ranger who now worked in corporate security. The second case was even more unusual. A woman in her 30s had been confronted by 4 men who tried to force her into an alley behind a restaurant in the International District. Witnesses reported seeing her defeat all 4 attackers in less than 2 minutes, after which the men had fled on foot. The woman had declined to file charges and had provided only minimal information to responding officers. The third case was the one that had caught Detective Santos's attention most strongly. A group of 3 men had attempted to rob someone in the parking garage beneath the convention center, but had been defeated by their intended victim. No official report had been filed, but security footage from the garage showed the entire confrontation, and building security had provided the video to police When they noticed the unusual nature of the incident, Detective Santos reviewed the security footage multiple times, paying close attention to the movements and techniques displayed by the victim. She had military training herself, having served 4 years in the Marines before joining the police force, and she recognized the professional efficiency with which the woman had handled her attackers. The woman in the video moved with the kind of precision and confidence that came from extensive combat training, not just casual self-defense classes. Her positioning, timing, and choice of targets all indicated someone with significant military or specialized law enforcement background. More interesting to Detective Santos was the fact that in all 3 cases, the attackers had been given multiple opportunities to retreat before the physical confrontation began. This suggested that the victims were not looking for fights, but were simply prepared to defend themselves when peaceful resolution became impossible. Detective Santos decided to investigate further. She began by pulling arrest records for the attackers in the cases where they had been apprehended. What she found was a network of small-time criminals who had been operating in downtown Seattle for several months, targeting what they perceived as easy victims in parking garages, near ATMs, and in other isolated locations. The group appeared to be loosely organized, with different combinations of members participating in different crimes. Some attacks involved only 1 or 2 people, while others involved as many as 5 or 6. Their success rate had been quite high, until the recent series of failed attempts against victims who knew how to fight back. Detective Santos cross-referenced the locations of all the attempted robberies, and found that they formed a clear geographic pattern. The criminals were operating in a specific area of downtown Seattle, focusing on locations where people would be alone and vulnerable. The parking garage where Sarah's confrontation had occurred was right in the center of this pattern. She also noticed that the failed attacks had occurred in sequence, with each unsuccessful robbery followed by a period of reduced activity in that specific area. It appeared that encountering trained resistance had made the criminal group more cautious and selective about their targets. Detective Santos decided to reach out to the woman from the parking garage footage to see if she could provide additional information about the attack. The building's security office was able to provide the name associated with the parking space where the incident had occurred, and a quick records check revealed that it belonged to Sarah Mitchell, a consultant who worked with corporate security firms. A deeper background check on Sarah Mitchell revealed her military service record, including 8 years as a Navy SEAL with multiple combat deployments. Detective Santos smiled as she read the information. That explained everything she had observed in the security footage. Detective Santos called Sarah's office and arranged a meeting to discuss the incident. She was particularly interested in learning whether Sarah had observed anything that might help identify and apprehend the broader criminal network that appeared to be operating in the area. They met at a coffee shop near the police station, where Sarah provided a detailed account of her encounter with Marcus, Danny, and Jake. She had brought her own documentation of the incident, including the detailed descriptions and vehicle information she had gathered. "I wasn't planning to get involved with any police investigation," Sarah explained as she handed over her notes. "But if these guys are part of a larger group that's targeting other people, I want to help stop them." Detective Santos reviewed Sarah's documentation and was impressed by its thoroughness and accuracy. "You've done better investigative work than some of my colleagues," she said. "Did you consider filing charges against the 3 who attacked you?" "I thought about it, but I decided to give them a chance to change direction on their own. I made it clear what would happen if they didn't take that chance." "And you think that was effective?" Sarah nodded. "I did some follow-up investigation, and all 3 of them have found legitimate employment in the past 2 weeks. Marcus is working construction, Danny got a job at a warehouse, and Jake started training as an automotive technician. It's possible they're just laying low temporarily, but their behavior suggests they're genuinely trying to go straight." Detective Santos made notes as Sarah spoke. She was curious about how Sarah had conducted her follow-up investigation. But she also recognized that someone with Sarah's background would have access to resources and techniques that most civilians wouldn't. "What about the broader pattern?" Detective Santos asked. "Do you think the group you encountered was part of something larger?" Based on their coordination and the fact that they had assigned roles, yes. They weren't just 3 friends who decided to try robbery on a whim. They had practiced working together, and they had a system for selecting targets and controlling situations. That suggests they had done it before and expected to do it again. Sarah paused to take a sip of her coffee before continuing. "I also think there were probably other teams operating in the same area using similar methods. The techniques they used were too refined for a group that had only attempted a few robberies." Detective Santos showed Sarah a map marking the locations of all the attempted robberies she had identified over the past 3 months. "Does this pattern match your assessment?" Sarah studied the map carefully, noting the geographic clustering and the timeline of incidents. Yes, this looks like coordinated activity. Multiple teams working the same general area, but varying their timing in specific locations to avoid establishing a predictable pattern. Any suggestions for how we might disrupt their operation? Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. The key is that they're selecting victims based on perceived vulnerability. They watch people, learn their routines, and choose targets who seem unlikely to resist effectively. If you could identify their observation posts and surveillance methods, you might be able to track them back to their coordination point. Detective Santos made more notes. What kind of observation posts would they use? Anywhere with clear sightlines to parking garages, ATMs, bus stops, and other locations where people are alone with cash or valuables. Coffee shops with outdoor seating, park benches, building lobbies with large windows. They need places where they can watch without drawing attention to themselves. And how long would they typically observe before making an approach? Based on how they approached me, probably 15 to 30 minutes. Long enough to confirm that the target is alone and to assess their likely response to confrontation. They also need time to coordinate positioning among team members. Detective Santos realized that Sarah's insights were providing her with a completely different perspective on how to investigate these crimes. Instead of just responding to incidents after they occurred, she could potentially identify criminal activity in the planning stages. Over the next hour, Sarah and Detective Santos developed a strategy for monitoring the downtown area for suspicious surveillance activity. Sarah agreed to provide training to plainclothes officers on how to recognize the behavioral indicators that might identify potential criminals conducting target assessment. There's something else you should know, Sarah said as their meeting concluded. I've been thinking about why these attacks have been happening more frequently recently. My guess is that economic pressure is forcing more people into criminal activity, but they're choosing crimes they think will be easy and low risk. What do you mean? Robbery seems simple compared to drug dealing, burglary, or other crimes that require more planning and specialized knowledge. Anyone can point a weapon at someone and demand money. But most people who try it don't understand how to control a confrontation, how to manage multiple variables, or how to handle situations when victims don't cooperate. Detective Santos nodded. So, they're attracted to crime that seems easy, but they're not prepared for the reality of what's involved. Exactly. And that makes them dangerous in unpredictable ways. They might panic and escalate to serious violence, or they might freeze up and create opportunities for victims to fight back. Either way, innocent people get hurt. Sarah's analysis helped Detective Santos understand not just how to catch the criminals, but also how to prevent future crimes. By addressing some of the underlying factors that were driving people toward robbery as a seemingly attractive option. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Detective Santos asked one final question. If you encounter something like this again, will you handle it the same way? Sarah smiled. I hope I never encounter it again. But if I do, I'll use whatever level of force is necessary to protect myself and end the threat. I gave those 3 guys a chance, because I thought they could learn from the experience. Not everyone would get the same consideration. Detective Santos understood that Sarah's restraint during her confrontation had been a choice, not a limitation. Someone with her training could have inflicted much more serious injuries if she had deemed it necessary. 2 days later, Detective Santos implemented the surveillance strategy she and Sarah had developed. Within a week, plainclothes officers had identified 3 separate teams conducting target assessment in downtown Seattle. The arrests that followed revealed a larger criminal network that had been responsible for more than 40 attempted robberies over the past 6 months. The investigation also revealed that Marcus, Danny, and Jake had indeed left the criminal organization and were maintaining legitimate employment. Their encounter with Sarah had apparently convinced them that the risks of continuing their criminal activities far outweighed any potential benefits. For Sarah, the meeting with Detective Santos had been a reminder of why her military training remained valuable in civilian life. The skills she had learned as a Navy SEAL were not just for combat situations, they were for any circumstances where people needed protection from those who would use violence to achieve their goals. 6 months after her confrontation in the parking garage, Sarah Mitchell found herself standing in front of a classroom full of corporate executives, delivering a presentation on personal security and threat assessment. The irony was not lost on her that the incident, which had started as a simple attempt to rob her, had evolved into a new aspect of her consulting business. Word of her expertise had spread through the Seattle business community after Detective Santos had mentioned her insights to other law enforcement officials, who had then shared the information with corporate security managers. Companies were increasingly interested in providing personal safety training to their employees, particularly those who worked late hours or traveled frequently for business. The most dangerous assumption you can make, Sarah told her audience, is that criminals will behave rationally or predictably. They often act on incomplete information, make poor decisions under pressure, and escalate situations beyond what they originally intended. In the back of the room, a familiar face caught her attention. Jake Morrison sat in the last row, wearing a clean button-down shirt and taking notes on everything she said. After the presentation ended, he approached her hesitantly. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Jake Morrison. I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you," Sarah said calmly. "You were the one who wanted to leave first that night." Jake nodded, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I wanted to thank you for not pressing charges against us, and I wanted you to know that what happened that night changed my life completely." Sarah studied his appearance, noting the clean clothes, the confident posture, and the genuine remorse in his voice. "What are you doing now?" "I'm studying criminal justice at Seattle Community College, and I work part-time as a security guard. My goal is to become a police officer." Jake paused before continuing. "I know that probably sounds crazy, considering where we met, but that night showed me what kind of person I wanted to be."
What do you mean?
"Watching you handle that situation with such control and confidence made me realize that there are people in the world who stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous or difficult. I wanted to be that kind of person instead of the kind who preys on others." Sarah was genuinely surprised by Jake's transformation, though her expression remained neutral. "What about Marcus and Danny?" "Marcus is working construction and going to anger management counseling. He's still embarrassed about what happened, but he's channeling that energy into legitimate work instead of crime. Danny got his GED and is training to be an EMT. He says he wants to help people instead of hurting them." "And you all decided this independently?" Jake shook his head. "We talked about it a lot after that night. What you said about finding better ways to make money stuck with all of us. But more than that, you showed us that we weren't as tough or smart as we thought we were. When someone can defeat 3 armed men without breaking a sweat, it makes you reconsider your entire approach to life." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "I'm glad to hear that all 3 of you found positive directions for your lives. That was always the best possible outcome." "Can I ask you something?" Jake said. "Why did you give us so many chances to walk away? You could have called the police immediately, or you could have hurt us much worse than you did. Why show mercy to people who were trying to rob you?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I believe people can change if they're given the opportunity and the motivation. You 3 weren't hardened criminals. You were young men who had made bad choices. I thought there was a chance you might learn from the experience and choose different paths. But what if we hadn't? What if we had kept trying to rob people? Then you would have eventually encountered someone less patient than I was, or you would have made the mistake that landed you in prison. Either way, the consequences would have been much more severe than what you experienced that night." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot. We got incredibly lucky that night, didn't we?" "You got a second chance," Sarah replied. "What you do with it is entirely up to you." After Jake left, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken since that night in the parking garage. Her consulting business had expanded to include personal safety training, threat assessment for corporate executives, and security planning for companies with employees who worked in high-risk environments. She had also become involved with several community organizations that worked with at-risk youth and ex-offenders, helping them develop legitimate skills and find stable employment. Her military background gave her credibility with people who might not trust traditional social workers or counselors. Detective Santos had become a close professional colleague, and together they had developed training programs for law enforcement officers on recognizing and preventing street crimes before they occurred. The surveillance techniques Sarah had taught were now being used by police departments throughout the Pacific Northwest. More importantly for Sarah personally, the incident had reminded her of why she had chosen military service in the first place. The skills and training she had received as a Navy SEAL were not just for fighting wars, they were for protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and standing up to those who would use violence to exploit others. 3 weeks later, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Marcus Thompson. Like Jake, he wanted to thank her for not ruining his life with criminal charges and to update her on his progress toward building a legitimate career. "I've been working construction for 6 months now," Marcus told her. "It's hard work, but it's honest money, and I'm learning skills that will help me start my own business someday." "What made you decide to change direction?" Sarah asked. "Honestly, getting beaten up by someone half my size made me realize I wasn't as tough as I thought I was, and the way you handled the whole situation, giving us chances to walk away, not humiliating us more than you had to, even warning us about the consequences instead of just calling the police immediately, It showed me what real strength looks like. Marcus paused before continuing. I spent my whole life thinking that being tough meant intimidating people and taking what I wanted. But you were tougher than all three of us combined. And you used that strength to protect yourself and give us an opportunity to change. That's the kind of person I want to be. Are you in touch with Jake and Danny? Yeah, we still hang out sometimes, but now we talk about our jobs and our goals instead of planning crimes. Jake is doing great in his criminal justice program, and Danny loves his EMT training. It's like we're completely different people than we were 6 months ago. You're the same people, Sarah corrected. You just made better choices about how to use your capabilities. 6 months later, Sarah received a graduation invitation from Jake Morrison. He had completed his criminal justice degree and had been accepted into the police academy. The invitation included a handwritten note thanking her for being the catalyst that changed his life's direction. At the graduation ceremony, Sarah sat in the audience watching Jake receive his degree. She noticed Marcus and Danny in the crowd as well, both dressed professionally and clearly proud of their friend's achievement. After the ceremony, all three former criminals approached Sarah together. Danny, who had always been the quietest of the group, spoke first. We wanted you to know that we've been volunteering with at-risk kids in our neighborhoods, telling them about what happened to us and trying to help them avoid making the same mistakes we did. We use our story as an example of how bad choices can lead to serious consequences, but also how it's never too late to change course, Marcus added. Jake, now wearing the uniform of a police academy graduate, extended his hand to Sarah. I want you to know that every day I'm in this uniform, I'll remember the lesson you taught us about using strength to protect people rather than exploit them. Sarah shook his hand and looked at all three men. I'm proud of all of you for the work you've done to rebuild your lives. You've proven that people can change when they're motivated to do so. As the three men walked away to rejoin their families and friends, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple attempt to rob her in a parking garage. What could have been a brief, violent encounter had evolved into a multi-year story of redemption, personal growth, and positive change. She realized that her decision to show restraint that night had been vindicated in the most meaningful way possible. Instead of simply defeating three criminals and moving on with her life, she had helped create three productive members of society who were now actively working to prevent others from making the same mistakes they had made. Detective Santos approached Sarah as the crowd began to disperse. I have to admit, when you first told me you had given those three a chance to reform instead of pressing charges, I thought you might be too optimistic about people's capacity for change. And now? Now I think you understood something about human nature that took me years in law enforcement to learn. Sometimes, the most powerful way to stop crime is to show criminals that there's a better way to live. Sarah nodded. The skills I learned in the military taught me how to fight, but the most important lesson was about when fighting should be the last resort rather than the first option. As she drove home from the graduation ceremony, Sarah thought about the chain of events that had started with three men making the worst decision of their lives and had ended with those same three men dedicating themselves to making positive contributions to their community. Her encounter in the parking garage had reminded her that the most important battles are often fought not with weapons or violence, but with the courage to give people chances to become better than they were and the wisdom to know when those chances are worth taking. The story had come full circle, from a moment of potential violence to a demonstration that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in how effectively you can defeat your enemies, but in how successfully you can transform them into allies in building a better world. Years later, when Sarah told this story in her training seminars, she would always end with the same message. The most dangerous person you can encounter is not the one who wants to hurt you. It's the one who has given up on the possibility that people can change. Don't let cynicism make you miss opportunities to create positive change in the world, even when those opportunities come disguised as threats.